Hello everybody and welcome back to Language and Communication with me, Dr. Josh Redstone. Now, I had planned on being caught up this week, but owing to some technical difficulties which I had to address, I have fallen behind again, so I want to apologize for that. Today, however, what I'm going to be getting us all caught up on is Russell and Kripke on names. So we're going to talk about semantics and referring. We're going to review some ideas, and we're going to encounter some new ideas. So why don't I just give a sort of a survey of our plan for the day. So what we're covering today is Chapter 4 from our textbook, as well as Naming and Necessity by Saul Kripke. This was initially a lecture that has been kind of turned into a book chapter. Now, okay, so let's get to our overview. Well, what do I want to do today? Well, a review of Russell is in order. I want to talk about Russell's theory of descriptions once again, just to freshen things up. And then we're going to review the criticisms of Russell that we talked about last time, so Donnellan's critique and Strawson's critique of Russell each. Then we will move on to talk about Russell on names. I kind of gestured at this a little bit last time, but mostly we were talking about Russell and definite descriptions, not specifically proper names. But we will talk about that today. We're going to address the claim of Russell's, what's called the name claim here, that proper names are definite descriptions in disguise, just like other singular terms are. Even definite descriptions themselves, when they take a subject-predicate form, are actually a trio of logical generalizations, if you remember from last time. And we'll talk about Russell's theory of names and kind of set it in opposition to the direct reference theory of names, which can be traced back to John Stuart Mill and was talked about more recently by Ruth Marcus. And this is kind of where Kripke picks up things later on, as we'll see. In any case, we'll be asking whether names are really just abbreviated definite descriptions, or whether they are a singular term that refers, that picks something out in the world. That's the Millian view. That's where names get their meaning from. So, then we'll talk about Kripke. We'll move on and we'll talk a little bit about his description between semantical theories and philosophical theories of referring. We're going to talk about his idea that names are rigid designators. And for this, we've got to talk a little bit about modality. So that's possibility, basically. When we're doing modal logic and we're talking about modality, as Kripke does, we're talking about things as they might have been, right? What is not the case now, but might have plausibly been the case in another possible world. Okay, so we're going to be talking about that kind of stuff. Very interesting. We'll also talk about his causal-historical theory of naming. And finally, we'll expand this causal-historical view of Kripke's to natural kind terms. And we'll do this by looking at a very famous thought experiment from Hilary Putnam, and how we can combine Kripke's and Putnam's work to kind of get a historical causal rigid designator kind of account of natural kind terms, which are terms that refer to natural kinds, water, human, these kinds of terms. So, well, that's the summary of what we'll be tackling today. Why don't we get started, and we'll begin with our review of Russell on definite descriptions. All right? All right. All right, so let's recall what Bertrand Russell has to say about definite descriptions. If you recall from our last couple of lectures, Intro to Theories of Meaning and Reference, you'll remember that Russell thought that definite descriptions followed by the definite article, or preceded by the definite article the, look like a kind of singular term when we look at them grammatically, right? Like you remember, the woman who lives there is a biochemist. That sentence seems to be a singular term. It's a definite description because it begins with the definite article the. It sounds like a singular term grammatically. The woman who lives there is a biochemist. The F is G, right? So logically, Russell thinks actually what looks like a singular grammatical term is actually three logical statements all connected together, and they're kind of disguised by the grammatical use, right? So what we're saying when we say the woman who lives there is a biochemist, although that looks like a subject-predicate term grammatically, logically it's three statements. At least one woman lives there, at most one woman lives there, and whoever lives there is a biochemist. So what looks like a singular term, our definite description, is actually this trio of logical statements. So Russell says because of that, definite descriptions aren't used referentially. They don't actually refer to things in the world by, like this. I'm referring ostensibly when I point to things, but words and sentences don't do that. Definite descriptions, more specifically, just don't do that kind of thing. They're not used referentially. They're actually used attributively, which will be important when we review some of the criticisms of Russell. So, definite descriptions for Russell are not really singular terms. They're these trios of logical statements. Now, this idea, this part of Russell's theory of descriptions, resolves the four logical puzzles that we've been looking at quite nicely, at least when it comes to definite descriptions. But Russell has, of course, been criticized by Strawson and Donnellan, whom we met last time. And Strawson says of Russell, well, Russell says that sentences can have meaning and be true or false because they express propositions that are true or false. But Strawson himself doesn't think that that's how sentences get the meaning that they have. So Russell thinks that, a sentence like, the woman who lives there is a biochemist, this apparently singular term, is actually expressing these three logical propositions. And if those three propositions are true, the sentence is true, and that's where it gets its meaning from. Strawson doesn't think that that's how this works. Strawson thinks that sentences do not get their meaning by virtue of whether they contain propositions that are true. They get their meaning because of how they are used by the speakers who use them. All right? Donnellan, of course, says Russell and Strawson are both a little off the mark here. Russell thinks all descriptions are attributive, in the sense that I just talked about a moment ago. Strawson seems to assume that all descriptions are referential, in the sense that, they pick out things or refer to things in the world. But Donnellan says they're both kind of off because descriptions are really used both kinds of ways. So, that's it for my quick little review. I think we should move on to the direct reference theory of names and on to Russell's name claim idea. So let's do that now. All right, the direct reference theory of names. I've mentioned the direct reference theory and kind of, I think, really used it interchangeably with the referential theory. I suppose the direct reference theory of names applies specifically to proper names, and sometimes this is known as the Millian understanding of names, or like a Millian kind of theory, because it attributed to John Stuart Mill, who said that names get their meaning because they single out, individuals, proper names, they single out individuals and introduce them into discourse. So, right, the direct reference theory of names suggests that names work the way they do because they get their meaning from what they designate, right? So my name means me because it picks me out in the world, right? So here we're not talking about the etymology of a particular name, right? We're not talking about like the etymology of my name, where my name comes from historically or linguistically. We're talking about how my name works in the language when people refer to me, when they talk about me, and when they use the word Josh, and this kind of thing. That's what we're talking about here. So here names obtain their meaning from what they designate. And proper names seem to be singular terms, right? We use them to pick out particular individuals all of the time, right? I can say the Queen of England, or I can say Elizabeth Windsor, right? The first is a definite description, second is a proper name, but they're both singular terms. At least that's what proper names seem to be. So, if there's any part of this referential theory of meaning that's true, it seems to be this direct reference idea when it comes to proper names. So if there is anything, any kind of linguistic expression that the referential theory can really be said to describe, it seems intuitively, in any case, that it is proper names, because we use them this way all the time, right? To pick out things in the world and bring these things into conversation. We do this with each other, with other human beings, and with our pets even. So what is Russell's name claim then? Well, Russell thinks that, like definite descriptions, names are not really singular terms. They don't really refer to things in the world. They are actually abbreviations of definite descriptions. So, names don't have meaning because they refer. Names have meaning, according to Russell, because they are attached to logical descriptions, just like definite descriptions are. So, for Russell at least, names get their meaning because of this hidden logical form that they have, right? These trios of generalized statements that are disguised by the grammatical form of the sentences that we hear, right? So again, the woman who lives there is a biochemist. We could change that to Jane, the biochemist, and we would define this woman Jane in a similar way, or we would find the meaning of her name in a similar way as we found the hidden meaning in the sentence, the woman who lives there is a biochemist. The meaning would really come from these logical statements that are disguised by the grammatical form of the sentence. And the logical form of the sentence is not something we have direct contact with, I suppose, according to Russell. So that's Russell's name claim. So a proper name like Canada is a proper name. Grumpy Cat is one that's in the slides here. Very nice. I miss Grumpy Cat. Saul Kripke, of course, whose work we're going to be talking about later. Another interesting fellow. Saul Kripke is a singular term. So Saul's Kripke, the word, according to Russell, does not refer to the individual Saul Kripke. Rather, it refers to these general statements, these logical statements that are disguised by the grammatical form of the word. Now, Russell's shown that his description, or rather his understanding of definite descriptions, works better than the referential theory of meaning does when it comes to explaining how definite descriptions actually get their meaning. He also addresses the four logical puzzles quite nicely, but we have to ask, does his theory actually work for proper names? Proper names are a very important and special kind of singular terms, and there are problems with the description theory of proper names, as it turns out. Not the direct reference theory, Russell's own theory when it comes to proper names. And I'm going to try and highlight this problem for you now. So, we can't really go back to our direct reference theory for names if we want to. At least it seems we can't go back to this direct reference million kind of way of understanding them, even though, as Lacan points out, it is intuitively million in character, right? This direct reference theory of names. But on the other hand, fixing identity with a definite description can be problematic. I'll put it this way. Names are the kind of thing, and this is maybe getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, but names are the kind of thing that are rigid in the sense that they refer to individuals, where in any possible world, that individual would have been the same individual, but otherwise things may have happened quite differently, right? Here, maybe I should make this more concrete. I think if I make it more concrete, it would be helpful. So, let's see. In any possible world, Nixon would not have won the presidency, right? Not necessarily. It's not necessarily true that Richard Nixon would have won the 1968 U.S. election, right? In our world, Richard Nixon did win the 1968 United States election, okay? But it could have been different. It could have been different. So, if we're trying to fix identity by saying that Richard Nixon, by virtue of its logical structure, is equivalent to a definite description like the winner of the 1968 U.S. election, again, by virtue of both of these statements' underlying logical structure, well, if we were to try to do that, we couldn't ask about how things might have otherwise been. We couldn't ask whether Richard Nixon might have lost, because if Richard Nixon is actually a disguise for the winner of the 1968 U.S. election, say Richard Nixon is the proper name, and the winner of the 1968 U.S. election is the definite description that's kind of disguised by the name, well, we can't just ask whether Nixon might have lost, if that's what his name means. Because that would be like asking if it's possible that one and only one person who won the 1968 election lost the 1968 election, right? We're kind of getting a little bit back to these identity statements that Frege talked about, but we're not talking about the grammatical form, we're talking about the logical form. If Richard Nixon and the winner of the 1968 U.S. election are logically equivalent, then we could never ask something like, is it possible that the one and only person who won the 1968 election could have lost the 1968 election, right? We can't deal with possibility here. This is part of the reason why Kripke talks about what he does in his address, and why it is entitled Naming and Necessity, because he's talking about necessity and possibility. And this all figures into his idea of rigid designation, which we'll get into shortly. So, this is a problem. Even if we aren't as restrictive as Russell is. I mean, Russell thinks that singular terms like names and definite descriptions can be thought of as groups of logical statements that are disguised by the grammatical structure of the sentence. Searle, we didn't talk about this very much, but Searle kind of proposes something similar with his idea of clusters. So we're not dealing with trios of logical statements, but perhaps larger clusters of concepts or what have you that that a name or a description might satisfy, but it doesn't have to satisfy all of them. It just has to satisfy enough of them, or the right ones, for someone to understand what a sentence in which a word like that features, like a name or a description, to understand what that sentence means. But Kripke tackles it differently. In any case, I feel like I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself again, so let's see. What are some of the specific problems of Russell's name claim again? I'll go over those once again before we continue, and I'll talk a little bit about what Kripke's beefs with these theories are. So let's do that now. So, I guess a clearer way to say what I'm trying to say, and to get Kripke's point across when it comes to the problem with description theories, is that the description theory takes a proper name to be equivalent to some kind of definite description, right? Which might be a set of logical statements, and that's where meaning comes from here, is the truth value of the statements that underwrite our proper name, okay? But these descriptions that names are attached to are multiple and ambiguous, and they refer to things which may have not been the case, right? So this is why Richard Nixon cannot be attached to the winner of the 1968 U.S. election without creating a problem, because there are imaginable possible worlds where Richard Nixon never won that election. So that can't be where the name Richard Nixon gets its meaning from, because it may not have been the case that Richard Nixon won the election. Perhaps he would have lost the election. Perhaps he would have never entered politics at all. Perhaps he would have been a gardener or something, right? Similarly, here in the slides, Dr. Wayne has a similar example. Descriptions do not attach to identity in a necessary way. For example, that Aristotle taught Alexander the Great is true, but it could have been false. Kripke wants to say that names get their meaning by virtue of the fact that they are a kind of description that is attached to an individual in a necessary way, whereas the descriptions that feature in Russell's description theory are not attached to individuals in a necessary way, right? So it's possible that Richard Nixon would have won the 1968 election. It's possible that he would have lost the election. It's possible that he might have never entered politics. It's possible that Aristotle might never have taught Alexander the Great. It's possible that Aristotle might never have been a student of Plato. But what is not possible was for Richard Nixon not to have been Richard Nixon. What is not possible is for Aristotle not to have been Aristotle. That's kind of what Kripke is getting at. And in these possible worlds, singular terms that capture things about these individuals that might have been different in other possible worlds are not rigid. They're what we could call flaccid designators. That's what Kripke calls them anyway. So we can have singular terms that designate different things in different worlds. Even take, for example, going back to Nixon, something like the winner of the 1968 election, or the president, even just the president of the United States, who won the 1968 election, right? Cannot be rigid, because they might designate different things in different worlds. But Richard Nixon designates the same individual in every possible world. So Richard Nixon is what Kripke calls a rigid designator, as opposed to a flaccid designator like the winner of the 1968 U.S. election, which could have been his opponent. I'm not up to speed with my late 20th century American election history, so I actually don't know who Nixon was running against. Let's go back to Grumpy Cat, because I have some notes here from Dr. Wayne. Grumpy Cat, a description like the top internet cat sensation cannot be where Grumpy Cat's name gets its meaning, right? If we were to take a Russellian descriptivist kind of take on it, can't be where it gets its name, because had things been otherwise, Grumpy Cat may not have actually been the top cat internet sensation, right? Maybe it would have been Cheerful Cat. Maybe there's an especially cheerful cat out there, and maybe Cheerful Cat would have been the #1 internet sensation in another possible world. So that can't be where Grumpy Cat, the name Grumpy Cat, gets its meaning, because top cat internet sensation is a flaccid designator. Grumpy Cat and other proper names are rigid designators. So names, unlike descriptions, don't connect with reference that vary from world to world. So a proper name isn't like a description like the winner of the 1968 United States election. that whatever individual satisfies, or whatever individual that describes could be different in another possible world. But proper names are not like that. Proper names are, according to Kripke, rigid designators. All right. Okay, before I get too far ahead of myself on this rigid designator stuff, I want to just introduce a distinction that Kripke does in his paper. This is a distinction between semantic theories versus referential theories for proper names. A semantic theory of proper names is a theory about the meaning of names. So a semantic theory is going to discuss what do names contribute when it comes to the meaning of the sentences in which they feature. So semantics is about what things mean, and a referential theory, or a theory of referring, is about the relationship between the name and the thing it refers to, or its referent. So this is a subtle distinction that Kripke introduces here, but it's important to keep in mind. So just to recap, a semantical theory of names asks how names contribute to the meaning of sentences in which they feature, and a referential theory, or a theory of referring, asks by virtue of what is there a referential link between the name and its referent, right? So how is there a link between a certain sign or symbol and the entity that it refers to? How does that link work versus what does the meaning of the, where does the meaning of the sign or the symbol come from? Subtly different kinds of theories that Kripke is talking about here. Now, for description theorists, who we've talked about quite a bit so far, we'll call these descriptivists, and they include thinkers like Frege and Russell. For them, for descriptivist thinkers, semantical and referential theories are combined together. And you can see this very clearly in Frege, for example, right? He's talking about sense as a mode of presentation of the referent, right? And for him, even sentences that don't have reference can mean something because they have a sense. So here, this connection between meaning and the name, as well as between the name and the referent, is kind of all part of the same question for Frege, right? For Russell, on the other hand, a name gets its meaning from its status as an abbreviated definite description, as we've seen. And a name refers to a thing when that thing uniquely satisfies a description. So again, for Russell, these questions are kind of smushed together into one question. At least that's what Kripke says is going on here. And thinkers like Frege and Russell maybe aren't aware that this is what's going on, and this is maybe why there are some problems that Kripke sees with how descriptivism tackles proper names and where they get their meaning from. For advocates of a million account of names, or the direct reference theory of names, a name's meaning doesn't tell us anything about how it's attached to its referent. So these are separate questions for a million, like, for example, John Stuart Mill, right? Or Ruth Marcus. Okay, now let's get on to the real meat and potatoes. Let's talk about Kripke's semantical theory, which is what I was kind of gesturing at earlier when I was getting ahead of myself, and that is his idea of rigid designation. So I'll try to explain rigid designation a little bit more clearly and succinctly, and we'll talk about how this works as a semantical theory. All right, let's get to that now. All right, so let's talk about rigid designation as a semantical theory. So, to try and sum everything up as succinctly as I can, for Kripke, names are singular terms that are also rigid designators. So they designate the same individual in all possible worlds, not just our world, right? And we're not talking about some kind of quantum mechanical multiverse thing here. We are just talking about what is logically possible. It's possible that things may have been otherwise. Things may not have been the way they are now. They may have been some other way. Names are the kinds of things that designate things that are the same across all of these different possible, all these different logical possibilities, right? So this is an idea called modality. It's the idea that it's the study of possibility, okay? So names are rigid designators. To say that something is a rigid designator is to say that it designates the same entity, excuse me, the same entity in a variety of possible situations or worlds, not just the one that happens to be the case. So descriptions, definite descriptions that in, are not rigid designators. They don't have to apply in the same way to the same thing across all possible worlds. So Kripke's view is informed by a lot of different philosophical commitments, but he outlines them all in naming and necessity, and they represent kind of a pretty big shift in analytic philosophy, for the reason that he was the first to talk about modal logic in this way, and to talk about possibility versus necessity when it comes to proper names. Other people hadn't really treated it this way before, as you can see. Like a very Russellian kind of theory, like a descriptivist account like Russell's, looks at one possible world, ours, not what might have otherwise been the case, right? But if things may have happened otherwise, Kripke says names, well, they can't get their meaning because they're definite descriptions. They get their meaning some other way. They get their meaning because they are rigid designators. So, a designator, like a name, is rigid when it designates the same thing in all possible worlds, whether that thing exists or not. You know, I can talk about Aristotle as the teacher of Alexander the Great in our world, but in another possible world, perhaps Alexander's student was not, or perhaps Aristotle's student was not Alexander the Great. But I can still talk about Aristotle even though the Aristotle that did not teach Alexander the Great and taught some other student does not exist. I can still name Aristotle in that possible world, even though things are different than they are here. There's still a being named Aristotle that I can identify there. So, if a name can do that, can designate rigidly, that means it's picking out a thing that exists in all possible worlds. This is a strongly rigid designator, right? You know, the Prime Minister of Canada may not have been Justin Trudeau. You know, maybe it would have been Andrew Scheer or Jagmeet Singh, right? So the Prime Minister of Canada is not a rigid designator. But the names, Justin Trudeau, Andrew Scheer, Jagmeet Singh, they are rigid designators, because even if they were all doing something else in other worlds, even if, say, all three of them never went into politics, we would still be naming those individuals with their names. But descriptions don't work like that. Names typically designate rigidly, but definite descriptions do not designate rigidly, typically. They can, but not usually. And there's a little test you can do for yourself here if you want to see whether something is a rigid designator or not. What you can do is plug variables into a sentence like N might not have been N. Descriptions work just fine, but names kind of sound off, right? So I can say Justin Trudeau might not have been the Prime Minister of Canada. Okay, so Prime Minister of Canada doesn't sound like a rigid designator. But if I say Justin Trudeau might not have been Justin Trudeau, well, that doesn't make any sense. So Justin Trudeau is a rigid designator. Now, some descriptions can be rigid, right? It's important not to overlook this. Donnellan's referential sense, for example, can provide some example of descriptions being rigid, right? When I'm using a description like the interesting looking man with the martini, might be rigid in a referential sense, although I don't know about that one. Well, in any case, where we can be certain about this is, for example, descriptions like in arithmetical expressions. They are rigid. So the positive square root of 9, right, refers to, well, 3. The positive square root of 9. And that refers to the number 3 in all possible modalities. Because numbers are just that kind of thing, right? So we can have rigid descriptions, but they're not really usual. In any case, names can also be flaccid designators too, in some cases at least. Cases where the name is actually standing for a description, like a trio of logical descriptions or a cluster of qualities. So like a Russellian description or a Searlean description. We could say something like the University of Ottawa is great, but it's no Carleton. I'm not really using Carleton to refer. I'm not using it referentially there, so it's kind of flaccid. In cases where description fixes a meaning and doesn't just identify the referent of a proper name, we could say that descriptions are kind of rigid. Here's an example that Dr. Wayne has on the slides for that in that show Criminal Minds. Often they don't know the criminal they're trying to catch, right? So they call him or her the unsub, right? The unidentified subject. And that's used rigidly to refer to the suspect of some kind of crime, even though they don't know who it is. So that's kind of rigid. Now, Kripke here, it's important to say, now that I've said all of this stuff about rigidity and flaccidity and so on and so forth, Kripke is not trying to endorse a purely Millian conception of proper names. He doesn't want to say that names merely denote. He also wants to understand where their meaning comes from. Just note that quickly before we continue. So why doesn't Kripke want to just go for a straight up Millian account of names, like argue for the Millian direct reference theory of names instead of arguing for a rigid designation as he does? Well, all Millian names are rigid designators, not all rigid designators are Millian names. So, as we've already seen, some definite descriptions are rigid designators, like the positive square root of 9. But that's not a Millian name. It's not a name of a person used to introduce that person, place, or thing into discourse, right? It's understood in terms of a definite description, a logical description that is the same in every possible world, because it's arithmetical, right? That's kind of just how math works. So Kripke doesn't view names as Millian, and he's trying to account for where they get their meanings with rigid designation and not offer a strictly Millian view of proper names. So on slide 13, there's a little talk of Millian names and positive and negative arguments for the direct reference theory. I just want to go over a few of these because Kripke is again arguing something that's a bit like the direct reference theory, but also something that departs from the direct reference theory. So the Millian conception of names, if you recall, is known as direct reference theory, right? So it's still endorsed by some thinkers, and it says that names, get their meaning because they pick out individuals and introduce them to conversation, right? But it is familiar, or rather, this account of names is vulnerable to the familiar four logical puzzles that we've already talked about. And Lacan talks about this at length in chapter 4 of the textbook. Now, Critics like Kripke are arguing that the direct reference theory's positive theses can be defended, but its negative theses can't. So we need to consider the ways that these theses approach the four puzzles, particularly the problem of substitutivity. So according to Lacan, there must be opaque and transparent readings of belief sentences, and the former can change their truth value. So let's try and unpack all of this a little bit on slide 13. Well, the positive direct reference thesis here that we're concerned with is that names in question really can be substituted without altering the sentence's truth value. So we could alter names like Clark Kent and Superman in a sentence like Lois Lane believes that blank is a journalist at the Daily Planet, and we would alter the truth value of the sentence if we switched one term for another there. This thesis is saying that, well, we can actually substitute names without altering the truth value of the sentence. This sounds a little crazy, right? But maybe it isn't so crazy. There are some examples of this kind of substitutivity working. If we take a sentence like we find on page 51 of the textbook, like Columbus believed that Castro's island was China. Well, the speaker, in uttering that sentence, makes this reference to Cuba, writes Lacan, without at all assuming that Columbus would have referred to Cuba in that way. So this is a case that's a bit similar to substituting an identity term, like Lois Lane believing Clark Kent is a journalist, but not believing Superman is a journalist. Something similar is going on here. Fidel Castro, of course, came along long after Columbus did, and when Columbus arrived in the Caribbean and saw Cuba, he would not have believed it was Castro's island, obviously, because Castro never existed. Nonetheless, a modern listener like us can understand what that sentence means. That sentence means Columbus believed the land he cited was China, but really the land he cited turned out to be part of what we nowadays call Cuba. Okay? So that's what that means. So maybe there really is no problem because we can understand a sentence like that. So this is a positive thesis. What about a negative reading of this million account of names? Well, names that don't have non-million readings, even in belief contexts, seems crazy. I'm quoting from the textbook here on page 51, by the way. Even in belief context seems crazy. And it's even worse when we consider that opaque readings are more readily heard than transparent ones. So, yeah, there might still be a problem here in that the direct reference theory of names says that the truth value shouldn't change. It should remain the same. And there are some cases we can find where this seems to be true. There are other cases where this is less straightforward. So, in any case, I won't spend too much time talking about this. I want to move on into the theory of referring. What we've been talking about up until now is really a theory of semantics. So, we're talking about how names get their meaning on the direct reference theory. What Kripke wants to do here, to try and get beyond the weaknesses of the negative theses of the theory of direct reference, is switch from a theory of semantics to a theory of referring, and that's why he makes this distinction earlier. So he's moving here from a semantic theory, which is a theory of how names contribute to the meaning of the sentences in which they feature, to a philosophical theory of referring, which, if you recall, is a hypothesis about the relation between a name and its referent. And he calls it a hypothesis and not a theory because Kripke is not super sure that he's right. He's going to let other thinkers kind of pick up the threads and do the work here. So that's why he presents this as kind of a hypothesis. But in any case, there are some pretty big problems that arise when it comes to descriptivism and the direct reference theory when it comes to proper names. So there are intractable approaches with each different approach. We need to get out of this. This is the motivation for Kripke's switching from a semantic theory to a philosophical theory of referring when it comes to proper names. So let's talk about his causal historical theory of referring, and we're moving from semantics now to referring, just to be clear. If anything is not clear about the discussion so far, please let me know. Please email me, send me a message on Discord, let me know in the comments section, or use the student forum, because this is, it's difficult to know how to distill this properly. I've kind of spent a few years with this stuff, and I tend to get it, but as last time, I tend to also kind of jump around a lot. So if my description is not as succinct as it could be, and you're still having some trouble, let me know some way or another, okay? But for now, we're going to move on from semantic theories to theories of referring, philosophical theories of referring. So let's look at Kripke's causal historical theory of referring to understand how he thinks referring works. Right, so on to the causal historical theory of referring. I'm just going to read this passage from Kripke's paper. This is from page 209, 210 in the readings. And this kind of captures what Kripke means by his causal historical theory of naming or referring, what that theory is all about. So he says, quote, "Someone, let's say a baby, is born. His parents call him by a certain name. They talk about him to their friends. Other people meet him. Through various sorts of talk, the name is spread from link to link, as if by a chain. A speaker who is on the far end of this chain, who has never heard about, say, Richard Feynman, in the marketplace or elsewhere, may be referring to Richard Feynman, even though he can't remember from whom he first heard of Feynman." I assume in this case the baby is Richard Feynman, the famous Nobel Prize-winning physicist. This is how names work. A name is kind of bestowed on somebody, and it keeps referring to that individual in this kind of causal chain. And even if I've never met directly, Richard Feynman, there's still ways that I can refer to Feynman, even though I'm not a direct link in the chain, right? So, basically what I'm trying to say is there's a way I could have come to have heard of that name in some way or another in part of this big series of causal chains, right? So this is the process that Kripke thinks underwrites naming, from where a person is given a name, and it illustrates the process by which names establish the link to the individual to whom they refer, or to whom they're meant to refer. So names, and it's important to keep this in mind, names don't refer by virtue of this naming ceremony, this first step where we have our baby who is named, but by the chain of communication going back to the named individual themselves. And that's on page 210 and 209 if you want to take a look at it. So this chain was created because the individual named is a member of a community which created all of these causal links with the use of his name. So that's the causal historical theory of referring, is that names refer because they are used in this causal historical way to denote individuals. So the causal chain of the name's use, rather than anything that the speaker believes about the individual, is what matters here. So it's not about any cognitive state that you have if you're using the name Richard Feynman or Josh Redstone or whatever. It's not about what's in your mind. It's about the agent or the individual to which that name refers, which comes from the name's use in this series of causal historical chains. Now, Kripke thinks that even if there are some details in this theory that have yet to be ironed out, this picture of referring captures the nature and function of names much better than description theories of names do. So better than like a Russell's kind of theory. But there are some objections to the causal historical theory of naming as well. We're going to take a quick look at those objections now before we move on to natural kind terms. So there's a couple objections we could raise against this that are illustrated by some interesting examples, right? What if, for example, there was a baby switch, right? A man that's now known as Jack has that name because a woman named a different baby Jack, and unbeknownst to the parents of these two people, the two people that are switched, well, they become switched, so that the baby that was meant to be named Jack, or who was named Jack in the naming ceremony, is now a different baby. Now Jack refers to our baby who was not named Jack in a naming ceremony. Or what about, this is an example from the textbook, Madagascar. Madagascar nowadays refers to the large island off the southern coast of Africa, but it actually used to refer to a part of the African mainland. So when we say Madagascar now, we're referring to this island, but the word Madagascar originally referred to some other place. Are we using it wrong, or has it come to have a different meaning? Or Ottawa. The word Ottawa used to refer just to the city of Ottawa proper, but now, after 2001, when several other municipalities amalgamated with Ottawa, Ottawa now refers to the city as well as these other municipalities, rather than just the city of Ottawa proper. So, here of examples like this, Lacan says, we don't want to be forced to say that our use of Madagascar still designates part of the mainland, or that Jack continues to refer to the other former baby rather than to the man everyone calls Jack. That's quoted from page 57 in your textbook if you want to go back and take a look. So, what do we do about weird cases like this? Well, one thing we have to do is consider the fact that, and this comes from Devitt, by the way, this reply that Lacan is covering in the textbook, the suggestion that names have multiple groundings. So naming ceremonies of the kind that Kripke talks about aren't the only kinds of events that can begin one of these causal historical chains of communication. There are other options, like other perceptual encounters, that might serve as a grounding event, so that, and again, I'm quoting here from page 57, so that instead of there being just a single linear causal chain that goes back from one's utterance to the naming ceremony, the structure is mangrove-like. So it's not a single chain, it's like a grove of mangroves that all grow into one another. The use of the word Jack is heavily grounded in perceptual encounters with the man others call Jack. And these groundings will overmaster the chain that began with the naming ceremony. So something like this may have happened with a word like Madagascar, or with Jack, if Jack was switched with a different baby at some point before he grew up and everyone learned his name was Jack. So even if names are multiply grounded, there is not like there's just one single naming event in the history of language for every proper name. So a word like Madagascar, although it may have initially referred to part of mainland Africa, through a series of perceptual encounters where maybe Madagascar was used to refer to the island off the southeast coast of Africa instead, maybe more causal chains began, more groundings of the word in that kind of context took place, and so Madagascar came to have the meaning that it did today. So that's how we can deal with that. What about another concern? One other concern, well, our first concern was whether names were multiply grounded and whether that is a worry, and it doesn't seem to be a worry. But what about whether naming requires a particular mental state? This is actually the third objection that Lacan discusses. It's the second objection that we're going to cover. Maybe we don't want to have to invoke multiple groundings, right? Maybe what matters here is that it's just the individual you have in mind when you name something. So Devitt and other people would call this, an ability to designate, which is a specific and sophisticated kind of mental state where one is designating while having the object or person that they are trying to designate in mind. So what matters is that you have a particular individual in mind when you're referring to that individual. Say Jack you have a particular person in mind when you refer to him. I'm not sure if this has to be a big worry, and in any case, Lacan says that this is something that actually takes us into the philosophy of mind and not just the philosophy of language. So this is something that we probably won't worry too much about here. But in any case, maybe we don't really need to worry about this too much, if only for the fact that this kind of falls outside of the scope of the class. In any case, perhaps I can say a little bit more about it in part, not part 2, but in the second lecture for this week. Anyway, some things to think about when it comes to Kripke's theory of referring. Think about whether Kripke goes too far in rejecting descriptivism. Maybe descriptions are doing some of the work in referring, even if they're not doing all of the work in referring. I guess it depends on the situation. Are we talking about proper names for individual people, or are we talking about mathematical terms, or are we maybe talking about natural kind terms, which we're going to look at in the next few minutes? So keep these questions in mind, and if you don't understand anything that I've lectured on today about Kripke, if you find it a little bit weird or confusing, let me know and I'll try to clear things up for you. But just keep these things in mind, reflect on them a little bit. For now, I think I'll wrap it up today by talking about Kripke's and Putnam's work on natural kind terms. So let's do that now. So Hilary Putnam, another analytic philosopher, together with Saul Kripke, extended both the semantic theory of rigid designation and the causal-historical theory of referring to cover what we call natural kind terms. So, natural kind terms are general, so they're not like names in that they pick out a specific individual, but they're not adjectives either. They don't just describe things. They pick out things, but not individual things. They pick out kinds of things that purportedly we could classify as natural kinds on the basis of some collection of characteristics. I'll get into this in a bit more detail in a moment. But in any case, natural kind terms are supposed to be semantically rigid. Natural kind terms for descriptivists are actually attached to descriptions, like names and definite descriptions are, regarding the kind's essential or basic features. Basically, what Putnam and Kripke are doing here is trying to extend these theories so that they account for not just singular terms, but also general kind terms, of which natural kind terms are a type. Now, natural kind terms, again, are not names, but they are kind of like names because they're semantically rigid. They can't refer to different things across different possible worlds for Putnam and Kripke. They have to refer to the same things. So if you recall that test, in another world, n might not have been n. You can apply that test to natural kind terms as well. And this diverges pretty sharply from the descriptionist view of natural kind terms, which again sees natural kind terms as really grammatical form disguises of these logical descriptions that are appealed to on the basis of essential features to fix identities. So, to use water as an example, water is a clear, odorless liquid. We find it covering large portions of the planet Earth's surface, and that's how we distinguish water. This natural kind term refers to this clear, odorless liquid that covers the Earth. Similarly, for animals, we could describe tigers as having ferocious temperaments, certain physical features, living in certain places. So what's going on here in the descriptivist view is that we're appealing to common sense stereotypes of things. But Putnam and Kripke argue that this view negates the possibility that these descriptions will infallibly fit with words that we use to name these terms. So natural kind terms should be defined by their scientific natures, really. So we're talking here about chemical compositions and genetic codes and things like that. So here, water is H2O. Maybe water might not have been odorless or tasteless, but water is always H2O across all possible worlds. Tigers may be born in captivity, but they would still have the same genetic code and the same temperament. Perhaps the same ferocious temperament could always still be there to show itself. You can't take the tiger out of the tiger, as it were, right? So that's what natural kind terms are supposed to do for Kripke and Putnam. Another way of putting this is that for Putnam and Kripke, natural kind terms are defined by scientific natures or scientific essences, not attributes or common sense stereotypes. There's a quote in page 59 of, I believe it's our textbook. Once one does discover the scientific essence of a natural kind, one has discovered the true metaphysical nature of that kind. And the kind has that nature in every possible world in which it is manifested. What change from world to world are the elements of the common sense stereotype? End quote. So what changes are the elements of the stereotype, not the metaphysical essence, not what this thing that the natural kind term names really is. So perhaps a rose by any other name would smell just as sweet, but a non-rose by the name of rose would not smell just as sweet. There's a little poetic analogy to try and capture what Kripke and Putnam are saying here. So what Putnam and Kripke are kind of getting at here is that there's a kind of objectivity in linguistic meaning, and we can demonstrate this with a thought experiment. This is a famous thought experiment from Putnam called Twin Earth. So we want to know if natural kind terms are rigid designators and if they refer through a chain of communication, a causal historical chain. The rigid designation is all about the semantic theory, so where these terms get their meaning, and the causal historical view is a theory about the relationship between the signs or the words or the symbols, what have you, and their reference. Keep that distinction in mind when you're thinking about twin Earth. So we have Earth and we have twin Earth. And what this shows is basically that if it's true that natural kind terms are rigid designators and they refer to what they do by virtue of some causal historical connection, then the meaning of these terms has to be at least partially located outside of the mind of the speaker. And this is important because the descriptivists hold that it's inside the mind of the speaker, because everything is really just, a set of logical statements, a set of propositions that can be true or false, right? So we have Earth and we have twin Earth to try and illustrate this. Everything is pretty much the same. Everybody's molecularly identical. There's a molecular identical copy of me and of you, and you're all taking this class on twin Earth. And we have the same mental states, the same thoughts in our heads. It's the exact same, molecule for molecule, except on twin Earth, we have what appears to be water, but which is actually not water. Water on Earth is H2O, and it's hydrating, it's clear, colorless, odorless, and it's made up of H2O. But on twin Earth, they have a clear, colorless, odorless liquid that falls from the sky, fills lakes and rivers, but its chemical composition is something else, say XYZ. I know that's not a real chemical composition, but this is the thought experiment, so for our purposes, that doesn't actually matter. So we have some twin earthers, and they call XYZ water because they're like us. They're in the same kind of states of mind when they refer to XYZ as water. So they say, pass me some water, I'm thirsty. They get a glass of XYZ instead of a glass of H2O. But they use the words in the same way that we do here when we say, I'd like a glass of water. So you could imagine that you're in a situation like that where you're really thirsty and you need a large glass of water. You say to your roommate, could you fetch me a glass of water? And if you are a duplicate of the people on real Earth, where water is H2O, then you're in the same psychological and neurological states when you say, please fetch me a giant glass of water, as you would with your Earth Prime version who's referring to H2O. So you and your twin mean the same thing, but what you say means different things. You, the speaker, the twin speaker, and your prime speaker on twin Earth and prime Earth, respectively, both mean to ask for water. But on twin Earth, the meaning of what you say actually is different than it is on Earth Prime. So there's a difference between what's meant by the speaker and what the statement actually means. So speakers on Earth and twin Earth can mean the same thing when they say, please fetch me a glass of water, but they don't express the same meaning when they say, please fetch me a glass of water, because what they're referring to with water on Earth versus on twin Earth refers to a different thing with a different metaphysical or scientific essence. I don't like this word, essence, but this is what the authors of the text and the figures we are reading use. I don't like the term essence. Just throwing that out there, okay? But anyway, this is the idea. Water may not have been colorless, odorless liquid. Maybe it would not have fallen from the sky. Things could have been different when it comes to our folk notions or our common stereotypes about water. But water could not have not been H2O. So this natural kind term, H2O, water, is got to be a rigid designator, because it doesn't mean XYZ, it means H2O, right? Even though speakers can use it and mean different things, but the meaning of the sentence, speakers on Earth and twin Earth, can mean the same thing but not express the same meaning. Does that make sense? If not, again, let me know in the comment section, so on and so forth. There's lots of ways to reach out for me if this is unclear. There's a lot of, here we're talking about possible worlds and twin Earth. This is a very abstract set of ideas we're talking about today. So if you are not clear, please do reach out to me, and I will try to clarify things on a one-on-one kind of basis, right? But anyway, what does this all mean? Well, this means, as Putnam famously said, that meaning just ain't in the head. And this kind of goes against descriptivist accounts, where meaning does depend on what's in the head. The logical structure that lies underneath the grammatical form of sentences that we form and utter. Okay? So, here linguistic meaning depends on what's there in the world, not what happens when we happen to think about what's in the world or say things about what's in the world. So, that's what twin Earth is supposed to show. The meaning depends on the way the world actually is, and not just what speakers mean or what they think about what things mean, so on and so forth. So meaning depends on how the world is. Okay, so I appreciate that this may have been a somewhat weird and confusing lecture. I do have this bad habit of kind of jumping back and forth between ideas that I'm familiar with, rather than explaining everything more linearly. So when I do the next lecture, I will offer a good recap again. And if you're not sure about anything, just reach out to me for clarification again. But today we've primarily been talking about the descriptivist account of names and Kripke's alternative to that, which is the idea, his semantic theory of rigid designation, that proper names refer to the same individual in every possible world. And we've also talked about the Causal-Historical Theory of Reference, which talks about the relationship between names and reference, not the semantics of names. And of course, we also talked about twin Earth and Putnam's idea, his thought experiment of twin Earth, and how we can extend some of Kripke's ideas to natural kind terms, which are not like names in some ways, but like names in other ways. Natural kind terms are rigid because they refer to things that are the same in every possible world. So water always refers to H2O. In every possible world. Water doesn't refer to XYZ. But what Putnam's twin Earth experiment shows us, thought experiment, remember, it's not a real experiment, it's a thought experiment, shows us that if people refer to XYZ instead of H2O using water, they're in the same state of mind that someone on Earth Prime is when they do that, and they're using the word in the same way, but they're using the word wrong. Therefore, meaning has to come from the world, not from what's in somebody's head, which is, you know, on the descriptivist theory, what is in somebody's head, what people believe about these logical statements that are hidden behind the grammatical structure of subject-predicate sentences and so on and so forth. It doesn't matter. That's not where meaning comes from. Meaning comes from, at least in part, the world. So I hope that that little bit at the end helped to tie everything together. But once again, for the bajillionth time, if you're not clear about this, please do reach out to me, because I know this stuff can be kind of like a bit weird to wrap your head around at first, because we're talking about thought experiments and possible worlds and alternative states of affairs and stuff. Modality, basically. We're talking about what is possible, not what is necessary. Anyway, that's it for today. The next lecture is going to be about use and psychological theories. So I suppose we'll get back to this idea of meaning possibly being found in the head versus being found in the world. That'll be fun. Of course, I'll offer a recap of everything I've talked about today as well. So, again, let me know if you've got any questions. Lots of ways to reach out to me. And in the meantime, I hope you all study hard. And I will get the next lecture to you as soon as I can. Again, I apologize for remaining behind. I was nearly caught up until I discovered that 3 of my lectures were very, very glitchy, and I had to kind of take a break and fix that stuff. But now we're getting on track. Once again, don't worry. I'll make sure to accommodate. I'll make sure to accommodate students as they need it. I will make sure to be flexible with dates and deadlines so that we continue to get through all of this material and we learn everything we need to learn for this class. Okay? All right. Well, that's it for today, and I will see you all next time. Bye for now, everybody.